Welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. In this video, I am going to share with you the 2 essential pen tips that I think every pyrography artist needs: a writer and a shader. Look at this large assortment of pen tips that I have amassed. You know what is pathetic? Is that I don't use most of them, and this isn't all of them that I own. For some strange reason, when I look at pen tips, I get the urge to buy one of every type in the hopes that I will find that perfect pen tip. Over the years, I have wasted a lot of money, and I've discovered that most of the pen tips aren't great for my style of artwork. So in this video, I will explain why I think there are only 2 essential pen tips. I will show you how I used them. My goal with this video is to help you from buying a bunch of pen tips that you don't need. Looking at the large variety of pen tips that are available, it can be confusing and even intimidating. You probably think, just like I did, that all of these pen tips do something different. Well, if you're a wood carver, that might be true. But most pyrography artists are not wood carvers. We tend to work on flat surfaces, not 3D objects. Now, I am not a wood carver, but my basic understanding is that they use different pen tips to create textures on their carvings, whereas pyrographers, like myself, use a shader to create different burn strokes that form textures. If you've watched a few of my tutorials, then you know that I have 4 basic burn strokes: uniform strokes, circular motion, pull-away strokes, and zigzags. Now I can use these burn strokes alone or layer them up to create numerous different textures. The most important thing is that any shader pen tip can be used for this. I pick pen tips based on their size. For example, if I'm working on something small and highly detailed, I will grab a small shader or a writer pen tip. If I'm doing large background work or border work, I tend to use a large shader that I own. If it helps, think about pen tips in the way you would a paintbrush. You could use this tiny little paintbrush to do a background, but using a larger brush would be easier and much faster. Now, that said, again, you can use almost any pen tip as a shader. Look at this artwork by Brenda Fox. Her rendition of Jingle Bells is awesome, and she created it using a writer pen tip. She has a lot more patience than I do. I'm not sure I could have done this. Now back to the essential pen tips that I think you should own. As I said before, I think every artist needs a writer and a shader. For the writer, I would pick Colwood's standard C tip. For the shader, I would pick Colwood's D shader. So let me explain why, and I will show you some examples of them in use. Plus, I'll provide some alternate pen tips. C Writer pen tip. I chose Colwood C Writer because of its versatility. Use the edge to get really thin lines. Decrease the edge angle, and the lines get thicker. Plus, you can create an assortment of dot sizes with this pen tip. I like to use the writer pen tip to burn in trace lines. I also use the pen tip when I'm doing highly detailed work in areas that would be difficult to fit a shader. Alternate writer. These 2 tips are Colwood's MR or micro writer pen tips. The one on the left is their old style that they no longer make. This is the style that I have seen in numerous other burner brands. Regardless of how this style of writer pen tip looks, it has the same output. You can create lines of various widths, but not quite as wide as the C writer can. And you can also create some different sized dots. Just like the C writer, I use the MR writers to burn in trace lines. I also use them in areas where it is hard to be precise with a shader. And another use for any writer pen tip is to add subtle texture to an area. For example, adding squiggly lines over this bark texture makes it look more detailed and a little rougher. I used a writer pen tip to burn long squiggly lines over the lion's mane to give it a coarse, scraggly look. The only time I must use a micro writer is when the area is so small that I need to be extremely precise. C versus MR. With the C writer, you can create a larger variety of line widths and dot sizes. Also, the larger and more rounded shape of the tip means it is less likely to sink down into the wood surface. With the MR writer, it's harder to get the line variety width that you can with the C writer, but the MR is good when you need a consistent line width. Plus, I think the MR writer is better with accuracy for very tiny details. D shader. If I had to pick just one shader to own, I would choose the D shader, and the reason is because of its versatility. Hold the pen tip at a steep angle to use the razor edge and burn very thin lines. You can use the front or toe of the tip for burning in small areas. The upper left edge is great for small to medium-sized burn strokes. And the long right edge can be used to create wide burn strokes that are great for background work. Now, I will admit it can be difficult to get consistent results with the long edge. I am using this shader to burn either uniform strokes or circular motion as I create the slightly out of focus bark on this tree. This technique is something that you can do with any shader. I've also used this shader to work on bird feathers. Again, I am using a combination of uniform strokes and circular motion to create the texture on the upper wing. I can also use the razor edge of this shader to burn zigzags, creating fur texture on animals. Alternate shader. If you do not have access to the D shader, then this style of shader is an excellent alternative. This is Colwood's J shader. Almost every brand of burner made has a tip that is identical or very similar to this style of shader. The only difference between it and the D shader is that the D shader can produce a wider burn stroke. I can use the shader to burn a combination of uniform strokes and circular motion to create the shape and texture of this dog's nose. I can use a combination of uniform strokes and circular motion to create the footsteps in this sand dune. And I can use the razor edge of the shader to burn zigzags and create fur texture. I'm sure you've figured it out by now, but anything you can do with the D shader, you can do with the J shader. D versus J. The D shader can produce a slightly wider burn stroke than the J shader. The J shader is a more commonly found tip shape. Unlike the D shader, I have found that almost every brand of burner has a pen tip shaped very similar to, if not exactly like, the J shader. Either shader can be used to create any of the textures that I know how to do. I prefer the D shader when working on backgrounds because of its ability to create a wider burn stroke. Flat versus bent. Depending on where you buy your shaders from, they may arrive flat. I have found that shaders are easier to use if they are bent at a 45-degree angle. Some manufacturers offer bent tips and others don't. For example, Optima offers a number of their pin tips in both the flat and bent format, and they charge the same price. Colwood, on the other hand, charges a fee to bend any pin tip. Also, Colwood bends the tips on the 2-wire leads, whereas most other companies bend the tips where the 2 leads end and the flat shader begins. This style of bending is how I prefer my shaders. Be aware that if you bend your own tips, you are avoiding any warranty that the tip may have. Now let me point out that not everyone cares for the flat shaders that I prefer. I've had artists tell me that spoon shaders are the greatest thing. I've had others tell me that ball tips are perfect to use. And the reason they like this type of shader is because the rounded shape glides over the wood easier. Now I mention this because we are all different. If you hate the shader you're using, then try another one. Eventually you will find the shader that is perfect for you. There is one more thing I want to say about this subject. When you are first learning, I think it is good to stick with just one shader. The reason is that you will learn the mechanics of that shader. You will know how to hold it to get different burn widths. You will know what temperatures it works best at on different types of woods. The more you are familiar with the mechanics of the shader, the less you have to think about that, and you can spend your time concentrating on burning. Well, that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week. Thank you for watching my video. Did you like the video and find the information helpful? If so, please subscribe. That would really help my channel. Well, thank you and have a great day.